talk will be by Professor John Robinson, and the title is Normalizing Sustainability Beyond Behavior Change. I'm briefly going to present Professor John Robinson. John Robinson is a professor at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and the School of the Environment at the University of Toronto. He is also an honorary professor with the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia and an adjunct professor with the Copenhagen Business School. At the University of Toronto, he is also presidential advisor on the environment, climate change, and sustainability. Professor Robinson's research focuses on the intersection of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and sustainability. As an expert in climate change mitigation, he is highly respected for his capacity to build bridges between academia, industry, and NGOs. So let's welcome Professor John Robinson.
Thanks very much, Fernanda. I want to begin by, I don't think Baruch is here now, but apologizing to Susan for missing her talk. However, I did look over the two papers that you sent, Susan, so I think I have a bit of a sense of what you had to say. And of course, I did hear Tom's talk, which as usual was fantastic and very rich. So what I want to do is complement some of that work coming from a slightly different point of view and maybe adding an approach or perspective to that work. Tom is being what I think of as a classically Canadian and saying, you know, let all a million flowers bloom and everything contribute instead of a battle of the band. So I'll try and follow that spirit as well. I want to begin, I guess, by saying that the deliberative process arguments that Tom was making, I think, are really crucial. I'm not going to talk about them, but they're very closely tied to some of the things that I want to say. And I think the reform versus transformation argument, an issue, is also really, really important. And that will, I hope, some ideas on that will come out of this discussion. I want to begin by asking a pretty simple question, a question that's on the mind of a lot of us, a lot of people around the world. Given decades and decades of research and study and analysis and indeed policy, why have we not achieved a sustainable world? I think the usual reasons that are given for this have to do with the power of vested interests in resisting the changes that are required, generalized resistance in the public at large to change, and ignorance about the true state of affairs, a lack of information. While all of those, I think, have some influence on the fact that we aren't where we wanted to be, have wanted to be in the past and want to be in the future, I want to propose three somewhat different reasons and possible responses having to do with the nature of the required changes, the importance of a question of what we might call development pathways, and a point about forms of intervention. And the net effect of adopting the kinds of arguments I'm going to be presenting here would be to shift the locus of agency somewhat away from a primary focus on individual conscious decision-making, which is so much the focus of so much of the literature on behavior change. So starting with the question of change itself, I wanted to talk a little bit about a very common way of thinking about the kinds of changes we need to have. And to illustrate that, I'm using the UNEP emissions gap report. It comes out every year, and it's sort of a lot of analysis of the so-called emissions gap. And I think this represents a typical way of thinking about the problem. And you can see in the diagram on the right, it's rather complex, but you see some lines kind of going up, and then you see some lines going down. And the difference between those two is the so-called gap. And you can see in this case, it's a gap between, if we look at the orange and the red lines, these are the expected emissions if we just follow existing policy, or maybe some announced policies that haven't really been implemented yet. The gap between that level, which is at the top, and either a 2-degree world or a 1.5-degree world. obviously it's a bigger gap for the 1.5-degree world. So this is a way of thinking about the future and about our agenda, which says basically we have to go from where we think we're going to be if we don't do anything more to where we want to be in the future, and somehow close that gap. The agenda then is very clear. We need to close the gap. We need to create change in our energy systems that will accomplish that closing of the gap. But I want to point out that this takes the baseline as given. And in fact, all of the analysis is about how to reduce those baseline curves at the top and get them down to where we want at the bottom in terms of emissions. And there's relatively little analysis of the actual baselines themselves. So the whole analysis, the whole approach, this whole approach to thinking about the future and to thinking about sustainability as closing the gap, as sort of torquing the curve down, all the negative curves that are going up of emissions, and somehow pulling them down to where we want them to be. All of that depends on the validity of that baseline. The problem with that approach is there isn't a single baseline. The world is littered about knee-deep in dead forecasts, all of which were wrong about what is the future that's going to unfold, including, by the way, a bunch of them that had the right number. The number came true, but for reasons different than in the forecast. So those are the most dangerous forecasts because they look like they're true, but they're actually deceptive about why that result was reached. So I think we need to recognize this idea of multiplicity of baselines. This is a study that was done in 2013 in Europe about the future of lifestyles by 2020. So it's an interesting study because the time has passed and we can now evaluate whether their prognostication was very good. I'm not going to go there. What I want to just point out is the kinds of things they were talking about that would have effects on future lifestyles. So we have augmented and programmed lives. I think we can say quite a lot of that has happened. Resilient and proactive citizens. Well, there is a whole bunch of evidence of this, and it's not all entirely positive in terms of the effects of that. And we're very familiar with that now. The culture of producing and sharing on the top right. And then the quest for purpose, what is perhaps not as well recognized in that study, but falls into this category, is the emergence of the $1 trillion well-being industry, just this massive increase in economic activity and products and services focused on health and well-being. So these are all big things, and they're changing under our feet. We can also look at the Megatrends literature. This happens to be one from PricewaterhouseCoopers, but it's a fairly standard list. The kinds of things that are really changing are obviously rapid urbanization. The urban population passed the rural population of the planet in size for the first time in human history about 2006. All future population growth in the planet is expected to be in cities. Climate change, we don't have to go into that in detail, but that's massive change occurring in a whole bunch of different dimensions, not just the biophysical. Geopolitical changes, we've seen this huge shift eastward to China, for example, of global economic power, demographic and social change, aging populations, and movement of people, and then technology. All of these things are changing rapidly as we speak. Here's a study that was done in Canada by the Policy Horizons group, which is a sort of foresight group in the federal government. And I don't want to go through all of these, I think 16 circles, but just to point out that these are all intended to be examples of things that are changing as we speak, and that may have very significant impact on human behavior, on human activities, on outcomes, on emissions, on consumption, and so on. You can see they're divided into culture, technology, governance, society, economy, environment. Everything is changing. If we drill down a little deeper and just say, let's look at industry, here's a study that comes actually out of the same source, the UN Environment Program from the Global Environmental Outlook 6, take a look at those circles and just think, every one of them has the potential, and which is being realized in many cases, of massively disruptive change to the private sector as a whole. Some of them are already started happening. Some are around the corner, but we can see signs of them. So the future is going to be very different than the past. At whatever scale we look at, whatever level we look at, we see this evidence of fundamental change. So I think the important point here is that there isn't a single baseline. There isn't a most likely future. There isn't a base case that we can use as a basis for subtracting to get to where we want to go, or indeed adding on other indicators to get higher on them. We don't know what that future is going to be. This is the fundamental lesson of scenario analysis. If we think through its modern expression, starting in the early 1970s with Shell, it was about multiple incommensurable baselines. This is the fundamental insight of scenario analysis, I believe. It's honored in the breach more than the observance, but it's crucial. There's very different pathways into the future, and they are not reducible to each other in terms of probability distributions and likelihood. They're just different pathways. Transformational change is already occurring in every one of the systems that I've been talking about, the 20 or 30 that I've had up on the screen. And so this isn't a question of creating change as if we're some kind of stagnant society and somehow we got to get things going and make change happen. This is about using the change that's already happening and steering it in more sustainable directions. Looking for leverage points. Where are these changes that I've just been describing? Where are they taking us? There's no guarantee they're taking us in more sustainable directions. Some of them are obviously taking us in less sustainable directions. So what we need to do is address these changes and look for those leverage points and the points of inflection that might be achieved through strategic intervention. This, I think, is a very different agenda than creating change. Somehow we have to change the world. I think what we have to do is start to tilt and steer and influence and shape these massive changes that are already happening around us. Okay, moving on to the question of pathways, because if we accept this kind of approach, we still have this question of how do we get to where we want to go? How do we know where we want to go, given that there's no longer a baseline? Well, I think we can learn something really powerful from the very recent work going on in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, on alternative futures. And basically what's happened is a complete revamping of all the scenario work that's been used in the IPCC for quite a long time, and the emergence of what are called shared socioeconomic pathways, SSPs. And what you see on this chart is different projections of global carbon emissions within different such pathways. So different scenarios in the future that give rise to very different carbon emissions. And take a look. We could have carbon emission, goes out to the year 2100. We could have let me back up. Notice the underlined word at the top of the screen. This is a crucial point. These are baseline scenarios. What does that mean? I've just been critiquing the concept of baseline, but what they're doing is multiple baselines, which is what I'm trying to argue for. But what is meant by baseline in this context is there's no climate policy in any of these scenarios beyond that which is already embodied in the base year, the opening year of the scenario. So what does this range tell us? It tells us we could have emissions 3 times as high as today, more than 3 times as high as today. You can see the yellow dot on the top right, or less than today without any new climate policy. How can this be possible? Well, it depends, of course, on the assumptions embedded in these different SSPs, shared socioeconomic pathways. And you can see the range. Each of them has a range because multiple models around the world are run with the same assumptions or slightly different assumptions, but within the same scenario family. And so you get this range. What's going on here? What does this range mean? What are these scenarios telling us? You get a bit of a feel for it by looking at the names given to the scenarios. It's not surprising that a fossil fueled development scenario would end up with high emissions, and a sustainability oriented one would be the lowest. One interesting fact about this is if you see the headlines in bullet form under the main headline for each SSP, they were trying to use a metaphor to cut across all these different scenarios, but they ended up having to drop it. It was too controversial. So they're no longer there. They just exist in slides like this that are still not updated to the proper terminology. So what we see here then from this is work that actually a conclusion we reached back in 2001 in the third assessment report. To reach our climate goals, the choice of pathway is more important than the choice of climate policy. And the reason is simple. If we are in an inherently high emission baseline future, like those top purple scenarios, the amount of climate policy we are going to need to achieve our climate goals will be ruinously expensive and probably massively coercive, just because it's such a huge difference between those outcomes and where we want to be. Whereas if we're in the bottom end of this range of scenarios, the additional climate policy we need is pretty modest and quite doable. So this is something that I think we said back in 2002. It's come up again and validated by the more recent analysis, but I challenge you to find it in very much literature or policy literature about climate change. And I'll repeat it again. To reach our climate goals, the choice of pathway is more important than the choice of climate policy. So this raises, of course, the question of what do we mean by pathway? In the fourth assessment report, we defined pathway as the complex array of technological, economic, social, institutional, cultural, and biophysical characteristics that determines the interactions between human and natural systems, including consumption and production patterns over time at a particular scale. So this is a way of thinking at a more collective level that Tom was alluding to about what's going on and what actions, behaviors, technologies, policies, and so on exist within that array, that kind of system of change. And remember, we have different internally coherent packages of assumptions about all these things that give rise to those scenarios. If we take a transitions theory approach to this and a multi-level governance theory approach to this, then we start to think of development paths as operating at the scale of socio-technical systems and at systems of governance. They are an emergent property. In other words, you can't blueprint your development path. You can't say, here's the development path we're going to be on and we're going to make it happen. It just doesn't work that way. There's all kinds. Someone said the only law of sociology is the law of unintended consequences, and there's lots of them at the scale and over these timeframes. So it is emergent, and that leads to an adaptive management requirement of how to deal with emergence and uncertainty and surprise. They exhibit interlinking regime rules and behaviors. So you can't easily change the larger system by changing individual pieces of the system. You have to think at sort of at the systems level, and it's reinforced at multiple levels and scales. So what needs to change? Well, clearly this kind of approach suggests that it's not simply technologies or behaviors, but constellations of actors, socio-technical systems, governance approaches, and culture. That's the kind of mix that we need to be thinking about in this development path kind of mode of operation. Social learning and experimentation are crucial drivers. We don't know all the answers for sure. We have to try out stuff. This is one of the reasons why it's so exciting that the real energy of the climate change debate has shifted from the national and international level down to cities. This happened about 10 years ago. It's really good news because there's only 180 countries, there's thousands of cities, and we need lots and lots of experimentation. And it's very context dependent of what works. So we need it in a more granular way. So I'm a big fan of the kind of urban scale approach to climate change and sustainability. Pressures from external systems. This is one of the insights for the multi-level perspective. The so-called landscape, changes in that landscape, which is what I was talking about a minute ago, it can be crucial. And if they combine with changes at the niche level, then you can lead to regime change. This is in a more sustainable direction in principle. Since the process is complex and emergent, I think we need exactly what Tom was talking about. We need collective, multi-stakeholder engagement processes. We need to involve people who will be affected, will also bring information to the table that wouldn't be there otherwise, add a whole legitimation component to this, to the kinds of policies and actions that might be required. I think we also have to recognize that this isn't just happening at these higher level systems, that we have to also get our hands dirty, get down into the institutional guts, and look at embedding some of these things into institutions. I like to argue that the fundamental barriers to sustainability are not technological, they're not economic, although they often look economic. They're about the job descriptions, performance evaluation criteria, codes of practice, professional standards, and other rules of the system that determine what people actually do on Monday morning, much more than their intentions and their interests. And so we need to, if you don't, you can have a great new policy, but if you don't have changes in the job descriptions, then the same old things will tend to be done and rewarded. A need for innovation spaces that allow experimentation. I take Tom's point about scaling up, but I do think a lot of this experimentation should happen at the community level and be combined in processes of alignment with higher level goals and policies. We had in Canada for a while all three levels of government, the municipal, the provincial, and the federal in accord on exactly the issues we're talking about here. That was a real opportunity. And there was an election in Ontario, and one of those three levels of government fell out of sync, and it suddenly became way harder to do the kinds of things that we've been arguing for. So looking for those windows of alignment up and down the system is really important. If we want policy, of course, is crucial. It's not sufficient, but it's crucial. These are the kinds of characteristics very familiar, I'm sure, to all of you, that we need to perhaps think about a longer time horizon. And by the way, the fact that we have a 4-year election cycle says nothing about the time horizon of policy. It doesn't limit it. If the populace wants longer term thinking, then there's a 4-year incentive every 4 years to be long term. If they don't, there isn't. Systems thinking, looking at that systems level I talked about earlier, this kind of adaptive management and adaptability, what I think of as surfing or a sailboat metaphor as opposed to a power boat metaphor. We're not trying to power our way into the future. We're trying to tack with the geopolitical and socio-technical winds and the cultural winds and the biophysical winds, the energy of the system, using it without degrading it to get where we want to go. And some kind of integrated decision-making process that does involve, as Tom said, deep levels of consultation and engagement. So the conclusion here on point number 2 is what pathway we're on is more important than what climate policies we choose. Development paths may be a useful way to approach the question of steering pathway change. And the key question is how to embed sustainability in institutional rule systems. So number 3, I want to spend a little more time on, and it's this question of intervention. So what do we do given these arguments? If we accept them, how do we act? As you've already heard at length, by people way more qualified than me to talk about them. There are many, many models of behavior change, attitude change, and so on out there in the literature. Many of them, as Tom has said, are based on a kind of rational choice approach of identifying problems, developing alternatives, choosing the optimal looking solution, implementing, and then evaluating that and going back to the beginning. And this rational choice approach, I would say, is the dominant. Tom talked about 3 different approaches, but I think this is still the most influential. And it leads often to what we might call a persuasive communication approach to creating change or steering change. And that is, we know the story, we're the experts, and we have to replace the audience, the public or the policymakers' wrong story, the story they have in their heads. We have to replace it with the story we know to be correct because we've done the research and we understand the problem. The focus is very much on conscious individual behavior change. So it's about making intentional decisions that will lead us in the direction we want to go and that may be different than what would happen absent our intervention. The premise is often that people are resistant to such change, but they can be convinced. There's this kind of Platonic ideal underlying a lot of this work. As Plato said, no one would act evilly if they really understood. So that's kind of what underlies a lot of these arguments is that kind of idea. And as Tom noted, it's usually based on an information deficit model of change. And here's one depiction of it. The idea is we want to create change down in the bottom right. And to change our behaviors, we need to change our intentions. And to change our intentions, we need attitude change or a belief change. And the way we do that is provide people with information. So I just want you to think right now, today in the world, how many public talks do you think there are on energy literacy or climate literacy, the science of climate change, just this endless series of campaigns and talks that are all based in a sense on this approach, that if only people understood through being given good information, we would get to the promised land. The problem is that in practice, we often bring our intentions in line with our behaviors and our beliefs and attitudes in line with our intentions and behaviors. In other words, the causality often works exactly the other way around. And there's research in many fields to support this. For example, decades of energy efficiency program evaluation. Billions of dollars have been spent doing energy efficiency programs around the world and a lot of evaluation of that. Health promotion, the whole field is basically about this issue. A whole bunch of social psychology and behavior change, some of which you heard more about earlier today, community-based social marketing, and the whole burgeoning field of social practice theory. So I just want to give you some examples that sort of buttress this idea. This is a study that Kahan and colleagues did in 2012 on what they called the SCT. That the SCT is a science comprehension thesis. And the hypothesis was the more people had literacy or numeracy about climate change, the more they knew, the more knowledgeable they were about the science, the higher the perceived risk would be. So that's the prediction, is the line would slope upward to the right. Here's what they found. Not much of an effect at all. Being more knowledgeable did not make you more concerned about the risks. In fact, if anything, the opposite was the case, although it's a very small effect. Here's what they said. Members of the public with the highest degrees of science literacy and technical reasoning capacity were not the most concerned about climate change. Rather, they were the ones among whom cultural polarization was greatest. This is a really important point. Then to pick an article actually written by Baruch Fischoff, the opening panelist of this session, also on this topic, our results suggest that education, whether measured in terms of general educational attainment, science educational attainment, or science literacy scores, may increase rather than decrease polarization on issues linked to political or religious identity. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge that what I think Susan talked about earlier today is ways of addressing some of these issues that can be quite effective. Nevertheless, there are these effects out there. And I think they amount to the failure of a paradigm, the information deficit paradigm that assumes just informing people will change behavior. And I wanted to give you a quote from a colleague of mine, David Maggs. The best evidence that the information deficit model doesn't work, in other words, the best evidence that information doesn't change behavior, is that we have 40 years of evidence that it doesn't work in all those fields I mentioned, and we still keep using it. It's still prominent. There's still many government education campaigns entirely premised on this idea that somehow climate literacy is a crucial part of changing behaviors. However, I think there's a deeper problem. Let's assume that everything I just said is wrong and that information provision can be crafted in ways that will have strong behavioral consequences. Research shows that that would not get us where we need to go. Those individual behavior changes make only a small difference with respect to overall sustainability impact. Here's a study, for example, on people's ecological footprint. And we have three kinds of citizens they measured. The brown or reddish dots are what they call brown consumers. They could care less about the environment. They're not interested. The green dots are greens. They're really concerned about environment. And the white dots are everybody else, sort of in the middle. And they've plotted the ecological footprint against income, household income. And as you can see, there is no pattern between brown and green. The green consumers are not below the brown in general in terms of ecological footprint. The conclusion was no statistically significant difference between the overall ecological footprints of green and brown consumers. Pro-environmental behavior was coupled with only a small reduction in ecological footprint in specific areas. Another study looked at the carbon footprint, not the ecological footprint. And here they had 4 groups: browns, beginners, energy savers, and super greens. And you can see very little difference here. If anything, the super greens are actually having a higher carbon footprint than the browns. So this study says no significant difference between the impacts of environmentally aware and environmentally unaware consumers. Because the motivation-driven activities of super greens, so there are activities there, are offset by structural factors. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, this study gives us a partial indication of that. Rather than using less energy, people high in environmental self-identity in our sample use slightly more energy and have a slightly bigger carbon footprint than those indicating less environmental awareness. So the same conclusion as the other two. But they go on to say both environmental impact and environmental self-identity increase steadily with rising income. And this is the crucial point. Your ecological footprint, your carbon footprint, is much more determined by your income than by your behavior. So if you're at the top end of the income scale, greens certainly have a lower footprint than browns. But that curve, the line from low to high income is a steep one. And you're both much higher than the people at the other end of the income scale, both browns and greens. So this is a sort of dispiriting finding in a way, although what it does is suggest the crucial importance of thinking beyond individual behavior. And it leads us to argue for what we call emergent dialogue processes, where we don't really know the story. We don't know the whole story. We know pieces of the story, we being, say, the experts or the researchers. We need to collectively co-create that story in ways that are going to be meaningful to people at multiple scales. The focus shifts a bit to cultural change and changes in social practices and in institutional rules. The premise is that change is omnipresent. It's already out there. And it leads to a social practice model of normalizing sustainability. And let me just say a word about social practice. This I would add to Tom's trio. I would add this as a fourth approach. And you're probably familiar with this, but the idea is that we carry certain practices, often quite unconsciously. So they're not behaviors in the individual conscious choice sense. They're things we do without really thinking about them a lot. And that's what is meant by the idea we carry them. They're constituted by a material dimension the infrastructure, the buildings, the roads, the paths, the tools we use, and so on. You have to have a toothbrush if you're going to brush your teeth. By meanings, that's a crucial part, cultural conventions, expectations, socially shared meanings, norms comes in here, and competencies. So the skills and abilities to do different things. If you hand a toothbrush to someone who's never even heard of brushing their teeth, they won't know what to do. These three components give rise to these social practices. An example from the world of mobility is bicycling. I work a little bit in Copenhagen, and it's just an amazing experience to be in a city where about half of all commuter travel is by bicycle. In Toronto, I think it's about 9%. So it's just an entirely different experience of mobility. But you need all these components. You need the skills and know-how. Asking someone to start taking a bike when they haven't ridden a bike since they were 16 and they're 52, that's a bit of a challenge. You need the safe routes. You need a functioning bike. You need appropriate clothes, changing facilities. And then you have various meanings attached to taking a bike. And the joke in Copenhagen is a cargo van is an SUV is a cargo bike. And I saw lots of people moving furniture on bikes. But that doesn't even enter into the realm of possibility in most North American cities. We just don't think that way. So when you combine the skills and capabilities with the materials, it gives rise to certain institutional behaviors and activities that start to become a virtuous circle of self-reinforcing activity. Copenhagen in 1960 was a car-dominated city. It hasn't always been bike-oriented. It was not at all. So that's been a change that's happened really in 50 years or so. So what we see then is a spectrum from the sort of behavioral side, which is about individual conscious choice, and which is rooted in a disciplinary sense in psychology and economics, and a sort of practice conception that's about collective unconscious carrying of practices that is more rooted in sociology and anthropology. Someone once said the major theoretical challenge of the social sciences is the locus of agency. Where is agency located, at what scale? And this spectrum has different answers to that question. So I would like to add that right-hand side to the mix a little more frequently. Now, I want to give you some examples. Here's a building we built at UBC. It opened its doors in 2011 as a living lab of sustainability, intended to be net positive in 4 environmental ways and 3 human ways. I had a PhD student, Sylvia Coleman, who did her dissertation on the human ways. Did the building actually make people healthier, happier, and more productive? And what role did social practices play in that transformation, if it happened? Starting with whether those outcomes were reached, this is kind of a summary slide where she found, in terms of self-report, very positive results. People loved the building. They felt they had higher degree of well-being, subjective well-being, higher productivity, and higher health. So it was very successful on the human sustainability side, according to the actual inhabitants of the building. She saw a bunch of new practices emerging. People weren't consciously deciding necessarily to do those things on the right-hand side of this table, but they were picking them up because they were kind of in the air. They were part of what it was to be an inhabitant of the SIRS building. She saw a bunch of new normals developing, where people were actually doing things differently than they were doing before, and those new things became normalized. They became the way that they were operating. Her conclusions were that SIRS this building did enable a transition from passive occupants to active inhabitants in a context of a story, a narrative about the building that was about being net positive, about contributing positively to both human well-being and environmental well-being. It is perceived by the people in it as being net positive in terms of the human factors. And normalizing sustainability through practices in a well-promoted interactive net positive building means combining and reframing meanings, objects and skills, all the three components of the practice theory approach. They're all crucial. And I don't have time to go into the details, but she documented all that. So that's an example where we see changes happening that aren't about behavior change campaigns. I'll give you another example in the same building to illustrate this even more strongly. As a study with the psychology department had a floor of the building, so the head of the department did some work on recycling behavior in SIRS, that's the right-hand green bar, and the student union building on the left. And they discovered much higher proper disposal in the SIRS building. So they tried to net out all the factors that were involved, and they came to the conclusion that the real difference was a sort of awareness or a sense of environmental consciousness in the SIRS building that was much stronger than in the student union building. In other words, they said people are significantly more likely to correctly choose the proper disposal bin in a building designed with sustainability in mind compared to a building that was not. This is an incredibly powerful conclusion if it stands up to future research, because it says urban design and building design can have very significant effects on human activity that aren't necessarily conscious behavior change campaigns at all. This was an observational study, and obviously there are different people in the two buildings, so there's all kinds of possibility for different effects that they didn't pick up. So they came back a few years later, but before I show you the second study, I'll show you just some pictures of the SIRS building. That'll give you a little bit of a sense. That's the only signage that exists. A little bit of a sense of the kind of the context within which people were acting very differently. The second study, they actually followed the same people. So it was an experimental study. They used deception. They followed a group of people who were meeting in SIRS and then went on to meet in the next door building, actually the psychology building, and looked at their use of recycling and found the same thing. As you can see here, the amount of garbage that was put into garbage containers in SIRS was much less than in the psychology building, and recycling and organics was up relative to the what they called the non-sustainable building. However, in an interesting outcome, they actually over-recycled. So they put so much, they took a bunch of stuff that should have gone into garbage and recycled it or put it into composting. So they overdid it. The effect was even more powerful than would be needed to result in the correct behavior. So the conclusions of the study were further support from the previous study that a building designed and built to communicate an atmosphere of sustainability can influence waste disposal behavior. However, atmospherics alone do not appear to be sufficient to just deliver the desired performance outcome. But I think it's pretty cool that this unconscious effect was actually so strong, it overdid the so-called virtuous behavior in the building. So what this suggests is a need to think about normalizing sustainability. As long as unsustainability is the default, as long as it's the norm, and we have to change people, we have to torque them away, we have to drag them to sustainable behavior, as long as we need those behavior change campaigns, we're failing, because we see a lot of persistence problems in these behavior change campaigns. They may work for a little while and then people snap back. It is the default that needs to change. And I think to do that, we really do need to move away from looking at individual behavior and to look at practices. It's not to say there's no role for individual behavior work, but that we need to add to that a pretty significant emphasis on changing the default in terms of these unconscious carried practices. And the goal of sustainability then is to make it the default. When people say we have to make sustainability sexy, my answer is no. We want to make it invisible. We want to make it absolutely just what you do without thinking. That's when we will have succeeded. We may have to go through a sexiness period to get there. That's arguable, but that's not where we want to be in the end. So in summary, just to finish off, we need to steer change. On the question of change, I think we need to steer change, not create it. At the level of underlying development paths, not just policies and technologies and behaviors, in order to normalize sustainability, that is, make it the default, not the change. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Robinson.